Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Hello as well to our panelists today. We are really happy to have you all here as Arcadians to talk about creating social impact and contributing to a better world. It's not only a pleasure, but it's our passion and it's part of our mission statement. A little housekeeping before we start. Everyone is muted, so please, if you have any question during the webinar, type it in the chat, and we will have at the end of the session 15 minutes for Q&A. We will do our best to answer all your questions, but if we don't have enough time, then we will come back to you after the webinar. So why we are all here, why today? Let me tell you that it's not a coincidence. We are here because today is the Human Rights Day. Today we commemorate that in 1948, the United Nations General Assembly adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This is a document that proclaims the fundamental rights that everyone is entitled to as a human being. And this year, the theme is on equality. It is about acknowledging that everyone is born free and equal in dignity and rights, but it's also about fighting against inequalities and discrimination. But the big question is like how we implement this, how we do it in our day-to-day work, how we do it with our projects, with our partnerships, how we are sure that everyone is represented in the discussions, in the decision-making process, how we are sure that no one is left behind. That are some of the questions that we wanted to discuss today. For sure, we will not find an answer to all of those questions, but this is a very good moment to talk about this and discuss also ways to work together, because for promoting human rights and to fight for justice on climate change, we also need to be united. So the idea of today is to share stories, to share experiences, and to explore ways to work together, because we are convinced that a human right-based approach is the key to a sustainable future and a just fight against climate change. So without more preambles, I want to introduce you to our 4 panelists today of this webinar that has been organized by Arcadis in a series around the COP26. Our first panelist is Serine Kira Kekotam from the UN Habitat. She is an environmental lawyer specialized in integrating climate change adaptation, urban resilience, and sustainable development into policies, strategies, and plans. She is the Program Management Officer at the UN Habitat headquarters in Kenya. Thanks for being here, Serine. Our second panelist is Adam Birchall from the Cornwall Council. He is the head of the Sustainable Development and Innovation. In this role, Adam and his team are responsible for the delivery of the Cornwall Local Plan, that is the strategic policies that articulate where and how development should come forward. Thanks for your participation, Adam. And now we move into the Arcadians. First, we have Nana Berti. She's our Global People Director for Diversity, Inclusions, and Employee Experience. Nowadays, Nana has a very, very important mission in Arcadis. She is leading the rollout of the human rights and labor policy, implementing the promotion of the human rights approach into our projects, our operation, and everything we do. Thanks, Nana, for being here. And last but not least, we have Alison Lloyd. She's a principal consultant in Arcadis, UK. Her work focuses on maximizing value for communities and clients through the design of transport hubs and urban connectivity. Alison has been involved in the Arcadis shelter program. We will talk more about that in a bit. And she has recently concluded the City Shapers program 2021 version with a research position on embedding social value in project delivery. We will also talk more about that. Thanks, Alison, for your participation. Sorry. And a bit about myself, maybe because I was just thinking that I need to talk about myself and I don't like it that a lot. But just for you to know, all of us. My name is Sophia Carrasco. I also work in Arcadis. I am an ESG consultant, environment, social, and governance consultant. I have been working for more than 20 years on social impacts and risks, stakeholder engagement, and today I'm helping clients on achieve their sustainability aspirations, promoting the inclusion of human rights approach into their ESG strategies and policies. So let's start. I did a very brief introduction about our panelists today, but it would be very nice for everyone to maybe introduce yourself and talk about for 2-3 minutes, just that everyone has time. How do you do in your day-to-day work? How do you deal with the issues, and what do you do to promote human rights and the fight against climate change? So maybe, Adam, we can start with you.
Hello. So we have quite a diverse role. We obviously work for the local council, which is a democratic body with all of the opportunity and challenge that gives for representing and balancing different views. But in terms of broad principles, I think one of the real challenges actually is starting with that principle that we recognize and we all hold different views of what is good, and people's truths differ entirely appropriately. The perception of what is true about a particular scenario will depend on their perspective, what part of the community they come from, what experience they've had of bureaucracy or administration in listening to them in the past. And that actually includes us as project managers in whatever our roles are. We have to recognize we bring our own values and prejudices to projects that we're involved with, which is fine, because if we didn't, we'd just be automatons, really. But as long as we're transparent and honest about that and recognize that we bring those values with us for good reasons. And so I spend my life really in the projects we deal with, trying to challenge orthodoxy in the good tradition of Jane Jacobs or Rachel Carson, if you go all the way back. And I think we need to do that both within our own organizations, but also I recognize that for you working with clients, that is a challenge, it's a risk. So we make ourselves vulnerable when we do that. Key thing that we do is try and balance power in conversation. There are inevitably always groups who are better connected, more articulate, better resourced than others. And so our job is to try and just keep them in balance with those who are less confident, less well resourced, and need help to have their voice heard. And finally, it's about professionalism. Not professionalism in a narrow technical way, but professionalism in the sense of those core values of transparency and record of dialogue, so that there is a clarity about how decisions have been arrived at. And so without being in the specifics of all of our projects that we deal with, those are the values we bring to our daily work.
Great, thanks. Maybe we go with Alison. Alison, can you tell us about your work and how that relates with human rights, the promotion of the human rights, and climate change.
Yeah, thanks, Sophia. So my day-to-days within the design engineering sphere in mobility, so that's in our transport infrastructure business area, and I currently sit in the UK aviation team. So my day-to-day involves working with clients and with multidisciplinary teams on infrastructure projects. That means from early planning stages right through to seeing kind of what goes into the ground. And that means that we're really dealing day to day with what I think of as the material places and networks that will still be in place in the next few decades. And so really asking the questions sincerely of how we minimize the negative environmental impacts of over the life cycle of an asset that we're designing, and how we maximize or what it even means to try and maximize the social value that they might generate. So say a station, a highway, airport hub or of, and really to do so kind of with the most equitable use of that asset in mind. So I think that means as well, just when we're working with clients, appreciating the complexity of the challenges that they are facing in trying to kind of make the best decisions in investing in infrastructure and in planning that infrastructure, and the key accountabilities that they also have in how they spend their money and kind of plan out their capital expenditure programs. And I think for that reason we often find ourselves in a position of kind of trying to be the ones who are asking the right questions, and listening carefully before we jump into solutions. And that means both with the clients and with stakeholders that are involved in that process. You also mentioned the shelter program and city shapers, so I'll quickly, just for those on the call, describe what those are. The shelter program is a fantastic program that Arcadis runs effectively in partnership with UN Habitat, and it's a conduit through which Arcadians can offer professional support and input into UN Habitat missions and any affiliated organizations. So hundreds, and in fact, I think even thousands of Arcadians have been involved in development projects internationally, and also last year throughout the COVID pandemic in providing technical support to organizations who are tackling response to the pandemic, as well as theoretical input and things like capacity training and things like that. So it's a fantastic partnership, and going strong, I believe. I'm sure Serena will pick up on that. And then in this past year, I've been involved in our Global City Shapers program. So Arcadis is really passionate about thinking about cities and the global trend of urbanization. And City Shapers is a program where we spend effectively 9 months looking into some of the biggest issues that face our cities, and how we tackle those with solutions to partner with our clients on. So in the UK, we looked at how you embed social value in project delivery, both the trends in what we're seeing around the emphasis on understanding and appreciate the social impact of the projects that we undertake. They are, of course, never neutral, and how you kind of address that from the start of a project, how you approach the project in the right way so that we actually maximize the benefits for communities and users, and the complexities and the progress that's being made in actually measuring and kind of keeping accountable in project delivery sense. So that's also been a fantastic to be involved in this year, and I think plays into this conversation.
Yes, thanks. Thanks, Alison. And maybe just because we were mentioning the UN Habitat, and it's good to hear, Celine, what can you tell us about the work that you do in the UN Habitat, and how these two topics that are very hot topics today when we talk about people, communities, projects, infrastructure, energy, all these kind of things. What can you tell us about your work and the work of the UN Habitat and human rights and climate change?
Thank you so much, and also for the invitation to this event today and being together with those distinguished panelists. And yeah, thank you also for the introduction, the linkage between the shelter program and UN Habitat itself. Yeah, so basically, maybe to take a step away, what's actually UN Habitat focusing at is the focuses on the resilience building in cities and in urban settlements. And why we're looking at that is because we always say that we believe that the climate battle actually can largely only be won and lost in cities. Cities, we all know, emits 75% of the greenhouse gas emissions. We have now reached the tipping point of urbanization, as Alison already mentioned, where now over 50% of the world's population live in cities, while cities actually only make like 3% of the Earth's surface. And we're expecting another 2.5 billion people by 2050. So all this brings unprecedented stresses about competition of resources, energy, food, water, land, housing, and all of that also in a frame where it's overshooting the planetary boundaries. So core human rights to that are affected in terms of like the equity, the access to certain justice systems, to certain resources that are there, the right to own property, the freedom of expression, the right to partake in public affairs, as also we maybe hear more in the Cornwall example, the right to work, the right to adequate standard of living, and all these things we believe like are kind of like a crossing point in cities itself. And I believe also that the COVID crisis hasn't made that easier. It actually kind of surfaced how vulnerable our cities are. And especially within this group of vulnerables, we have like the marginalized that are most vulnerable. And climate change is exacerbating that. So in that way, human rights and climate change is something that just goes throughout our whole work from the perspective of, if I take it from a climate change perspective, the enabling environment that we need to produce. So when we give our technical expertise to member states, what do they need to implement into their national determined contribution, into their national climate change policies, into their strategies that reflects the needs of the urban most vulnerable, and how do we actually then get into more ambitious climate action, get into more ambitious inclusive rights. And these, of course, always with the language of the human rights-based approach. How do we achieve a greater multi-level governance between vertical sectors, but also horizontal sectors, that partake of all of our societies? So all these things is something where we hope to bring in a stronger policy environment, a stronger strategy, and stronger action environment. And that, of course, needs to go down also in terms of like finance, breaking the silos of finance from the national level to local level to actually community level, to actually enable communities to respond in a resilient way to climate change and human rights breaches. So this is a bit of the little window that we do, and yeah, relates very much to today's topic. So thank you for the invitation.
Thanks. And Nana, we have talked about what we are doing with our projects at the organization local level, with our partners, and what we are doing in Arcadis. What can you tell us about this big challenge that we have and what we have been working on?
It's a big challenge, all right. So I think you've definitely described that well. So I'm actually the Global People Director for Diversity, Belonging and Human Rights at Arcadis globally. And that really, the sum of all of that, as you've just said, is the impact on experience, impact on employee experience, but also impact on the experience of those that we call our stakeholders, or those that are close enough for us to be able to influence or impact. So I think that's the one key thing here that we're doing at Arcadis. We're looking at our Arcadians, that's what we call ourselves over here, but we're also looking at the people and the communities that Arcadians impact as well. And I suppose from my personal leadership point of view, I personally, what I bring to the role is I personally believe and have always believed in social justice. Many people probably heard me tell of being young and fighting for people who couldn't fight for themselves, you know, from a young age. And that's what I've brought into the team. And that's the team that I'm developing here, because if we have that fundamental belief and action and vision around social equity as the foundation, and being people centric, that means that we will be in a place where we are influencing things all around us, rather than maybe in 10, 15, 20 years time still having this conversation, you know. And to be able to do that, some of the key skill sets and some of the capabilities that we're really trying to develop within the business to put human rights first, so that it's just intrinsic in all we do, are things like recognizing the value of collaboration. That's the first step, right? I think it's an undersold value, collaboration. People think they collaborate, but actually what they do is just talk at each other and over each other. So that's quite an important thing. And I think we're about to have a really good discussion here with my fellow panelists here. I think creative thought is an important part of what my team's doing, what Arcadis is doing centrally, what we're doing with our people here. And then also being free to present alternative perspectives and being able to discuss those perspectives and the impact of what's at the end of those perspectives, the outcomes, is something that we're also doing within Arcadis. And again, very much internal and externally. And because of that diversity belonging part of my leadership, my role, it's also about having the appetite to continually learn. That means that sometimes, yes, we do fail, but are we learning from that? Are we learning so that we don't make that same mistake again? Because the things that we do individually and as an organization, it impacts someone somewhere, right? There's always somebody that it impacts. And so starting to think about that, well, not starting, continuing to think about that and building up on that really changes us to be leaders and influencers, to do things, you know, for the greater good. And that's important, because if you're thinking about human rights on Human Rights Day, it's about representing that shift in our thinking. Traditionally, when companies think about having an impact, they tend to act in what the human rights field would call promotion of human rights, or do good where possible approach. And what we really want to do is include things like actually focusing on job creation, really making sure that it's impactful. And, you know, there is an opportunity. We're lessening the impact of those people who have unequal opportunities and unequal experiences as well. And to not have it disconnected and divorced from how a business might look at the adverse impact, direct or indirect adverse impact it's having on people elsewhere. And whether that's through products, services, or via the relationships that we have with clients, suppliers as well. So it's an influencing position. Adam very much talked about influencing in his opening. And I think we also have the opportunity as Arcadians and as Arcadis as a whole to influence, to challenge ourselves, but to influence. And that's what my team and Arcadians all around are focused on doing.
Great, thanks. And I think that relates a lot with my question to Adam, because I think in this webinar we are kind of represent different part of the puzzle, and we cannot work by ourselves. Like, I guess it's impossible. And as a local organization, as a council, you really have a lot of contact, and you have a lot of contact with the communities, but you also have to articulate the different stakeholders in that area. So how can we work together? What kind of tips, task, activity have worked good for you, and you can kind of see also and explore new ways to work together, because I guess it's the only way.
Yes, and it's especially true in the work we do as a planning authority, because on the one hand we are trying to facilitate growth, build houses, create facilities for employment and learning, but that not usually, always involves change for a community. Quite often involves building on green fields, And so that's why it can be a challenge for building houses and good quality houses for the people who need houses and want to live in them is a really positive thing. For people who are worried about landscape and agricultural capacity, less good thing. And balancing that is the real issue. And so I think the first thing to acknowledge is that the environments that we work in, that we all work in, are always complex, always contested, always emergent, generally over many, many years. And that's true whether it's a UK built environment context or a post-conflict zone. People's behaviours, I suspect, are surprisingly similar at a local political level. There's always all of those little power struggles that go on. One of the quotes I really like is from a colleague that we work with both in Cornwall and you as Arcadis, Charles Campion from JTP, who has a lovely quote that says humans are naturally collaborative and proactive in shaping their environments around them. And actually all we need as people is the opportunity to do that. And so getting local organizations to come together, the trick is finding ways to broker those negotiations and finding those areas of common ground, of which ultimately the tools are structured conversations in whatever form that is, whether that we define that as community planning or simply finding those moments where if we thought about it as ends, ways and means align, by which I mean, well, clearly you have to have an end in mind or a way of formulating an end. But if you've only got that and you don't have the ways to deliver it or the means to deliver it, well, it's always ever going to be an idea. Equally, if you only ever have the means to deliver it and no idea of where you're going, that's not a lot of use either. And that's where the interaction, I think, between client and consultant is really important, because it's that marriage that helps answer or square that circle.
Great. And on the other side, from a consultant side, Alison, what can you tell us about what are the clients, the usual clients that you work, or the new clients, why they approach, and how is this social impact, not only addressing those social risks related to the project that we develop, but also this challenge to help them to create social impact?
Yeah, great question. I'll quickly make a comment on just what Adam was saying there as well, because I think it blends into what we're trying to help clients with as well. Is Nana mentioned, are we actually learning from our failures, and are we actually is that a continuous loop? And I think one of the big pieces around that conversation is it an ongoing conversation? I think something that consultation on projects can sometimes fall foul of it is kind of consultation to get to a start, and then that project happens, and then it kind of, the cogs get moving, and you kind of, everybody puts their head down. And I think that's also a continuous challenge to keep that consultation appropriate and continuous, so that we learn from it. Yeah, I think the conversation, certainly in transport, and in all sectors really, but from what we're seeing with clients, is very focused on net zero and how to decarbonize transportation at the moment. And in the other hand to that is how you manage the social impact of that transition. So I think there are considerations there around the actual transition itself. And if we think about if we think about supply chains and if we think about critical connectivity that current transport networks provide, how you kind of maintain those really important and valuable elements whilst making a greener transition is a complexity that clients are thinking about. And also in the same in the same space, really thinking about what is the social impact of the projects that they're implementing. I think that in the UK, we had the Social Value Act in 2012, which really obligated public authorities and publicly procured projects to be able to demonstrate that the way that they are procuring work and the way that they are implementing projects adds value to local communities. So that's very contextual. It's very much kind of where you are doing that work. Is it creating value for the people, not just, for example, the users of the asset? And so that could be job creation, that could be education, all sorts of different factors. And now we're very much seeing that thinking in all spheres. So with private clients as well. And I think it's really healthy. I think it's really, it's obviously the direction that we need to be moving in. And one of the challenges that we see potentially is how you bring that thinking in right from the inception of what that project brief is. So, and that comes back to that same thing of who's sitting around the table deciding what that project or that asset improvement is going to deliver. Very much around putting a business case together. You'd think about, what's the package of benefits that this project is going to deliver. And I think one of the things we're saying now is that it's not just the financiers, the investors, the direct clients that should benefit from work, but it's also saying, well, what is the wider fallout from this going to be, and how do we, even without kind of extra effort or extra resource, how do we design it, how do we manage it, how do we deliver it in a way that actually everybody who interacts with it will benefit, and that particularly in the case of public transport, that access and that interaction with the asset is fully equitable for all users. And so yeah, so I think it's very much it's very much a challenge trying to think about those two very prominent issues at the same time, thinking about that decarbonisation process, and also at the same time maximising that social impact and minimising any adverse impact to people and their rights and an economic situation in that process.
Yeah, and especially with transport, because I think there is a very interesting phase of transport that it is not only related with a specific right, but also provide that access to the other rights.
Absolutely, yeah.
Health, education, our kind of the time that we want to experience culture and do sport or everything else. So it's really like a related, like the human right, promoting equality and promoting equality through transport infrastructure, the design, how you access to the bus, the public transport, but other means of transport as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if you think about how long kind of implementing transport infrastructure can take from, somebody first drawing a line on a page to actually it being commissioned, often taking much longer than anyone anticipates in the first instance. That process it can be a really long period of time, and then that infrastructure will be in place for generations. And so really thinking about in the midst of trends that we're seeing, as Serene said, in terms of urbanization, are we putting in the right networks? Are we thinking about how people travel in the right way? And is there enough inclusion in that conversation to make sure it's meeting the needs of communities?
Right. And Serene, because we were just talking about how transport promote equality, and in the UN Habitat, you work with the poorest of the poor. And you also have to partner with a lot of organizations to kind of implement and execute the project. Government, multilateral agency, donors, companies, like businesses that sometimes are involved in the different phases of a project. So how is that work with these different partners, and how you also kind of invite them to think different about climate change, about resilience, about human rights, about promoting equality?
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think there's there's a big question, and I think it's not easy to just answer straightforward. But I think one perspective is there's a study saying that 75% of the infrastructure is yet to be built to meet the needs of the upcoming population. So meeting the population trend with what it actually needed to be built. For me, that is also a huge opportunity to have that infrastructure that needs to be built, make it resilient, make it human-centered, make it to the approach that also Alison mentioned, like how do we commute actually in a very fair and just way. So that is also something that actually a lot of stakeholders are interested in. It's not, I mean, everyone wants to do actually good and wants to do even better and wants to do no harm, especially with the actors that we are working with. But everyone has a different perception of that. Everyone has a different agenda to that. As Adam mentioned also at the beginning, it's the different perception to truth, but every one of these perceptions are also legitimate. And then you find the common ground through participation, through listening and to communication into that, and also understanding what is actually our different and different roles and responsibility. We have that in one or the other way, even in our Paris Agreement, where we speak of like differentiated responsibilities, roles and responsibilities. We have that in one or the other way when we ask industrialized countries to actually do more on their parts of mitigation than what we ask from least developing countries and developing countries. So that is what I'm also looking into, the power dynamics that was earlier mentioned. It is not fair to ask the same responsibility from different stakeholders if it's not within their capacity. So to understand really the capacity that everyone comes to the table is super critical, to not just burn expectations, to not be just a tokenism of engagement. And there also comes in, we always think like, okay, how do we, how do we describe vulnerability? How do we get to the point of like identifying what is like the breach here? Is it like a qualitative approach? Is it something where I'm having a tick box on, climate change and disaster risk analysis and so on and so forth? But what comes also into that is not only the data, the science behind it, it's also the anecdotal knowledge, the knowledge of our community to understand what sort of stress and impacts they are facing. What is it that, for example, if a reoccurring flood comes in, what is that for stress on the social and economic burden to the most vulnerable poor? So these understandings are consultation processes, is an outreach, is a fair outreach, and is a participatory planning. We can't just, just anticipate, okay, based on our science, I need to do X, Y, Z resilient infrastructure, then I build it, and as Alison said, it's there in 10 years' time, and then I haven't anticipated that in 10 years' time, I actually have 1 more million people in a shed living on fragile land. I have a refugee crisis pushing people into very very fragile land and into boundaries where there's a lot of environmental degradation. If we don't consider these things holistically, we can't have a human rights approach. It's not there. So that is really critical. So I'm really happy to have that many of the other speakers have mentioned that as well in the beginning. Thank you.
Thanks. And you mentioned something very relevant and important. It's like every one of us has a role, has a task, and there are different challenges, but at the same time, there are different responsibilities. And I want to also ask Nana about this because, well, in my case, we advise clients and we help clients to really incorporate the human rights approach into what they do. sometimes for legal compliance, other time because there are certain responsibilities. But we also have the question or kind of the concern that they see that is something kind of far away, that it's a big thing, how I will do it, how I do implement it. And I always said, well, in Arcadis, we start and we are committed and it's a process. So what can you tell us about that also could help? Because there are for sure more people in the webinar that have the same question. Yes, like who could oppose to this? But how can we do it?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I hear you asking for a formula somewhere in there.
No. Impossible in 1 hour. We have been working on this
We need more time for sure, for sure. But you know what? It boils. There isn't an answer overall, and I think there are many companies who are still trying to make it happen. And but there is support out there. Actually, I should say so. Organization like Serene's and others are out there providing research, insight, support, knowledge. And you know, one of the things that we've done this year is that we've held 3 workshops, and I'm sure you were probably one of them, Sophia. But we've held 3 workshops. One was internal, where we consulted a vast array of our people from all parts of the organization, and we just asked them the question, what do you think we should be doing? What are we doing right? What could we be doing better? What can we learn from our clients and those people that you interact with and the communities that you see face to face? Because we have to be very, very cognizant of the fact that our employees are out there embracing, experiencing, seeing a lot of things. And so we have to take that feedback back. So if you're on the call and you work for an organization, you're thinking, how can I make that first step? I can guarantee you that your employees, those really close to you, actually have a lot of great ideas. So how are you engaging them? How are you asking them what they are seeing, experiencing, hearing from the communities, clients, suppliers, and other stakeholders that they are working with? And what resonates with them that we can do, you know, or you, the organization that you, wherever you're from, can do that resonates with the culture and leadership and ways of working is definitely one way to do that. One of the things that we've started a conversation around is the simple question, and it can be phrased in a couple of ways, is what is the risk to the business, right? From a social impact point of view, from a human rights point of view, what is the risk to the business if we do or don't do something? And then the second part of that question, I mentioned there was a flip side to that, is what is the risk to people? And how might that be connected to the risk? Because if it's not a risk to the business, which then impacts maybe employees and then the employees who are connected to others, then there is for sure some sort of connection to that risk of others. Right. When we were doing our sort of insight and market research into our strategy, for our 2020 strategy. So our current strategy is called Maximizing Impact in a positive way. Our market, we looked at the social drivers, and having that sort of insight into the social drivers that impact our business, our market, our clients, helps to put into perspective the areas that you should be focusing on, should be having conversations on, should be putting maybe your time, your resource, your energy into, and that which matters to your clients. I know we're all from very different organizations, but at the end of the day, most of us have a client who has a client, and often that is very much generally people in the community. So I think ask for that input from employees. They are so close to the ground. But also don't be afraid to have those open, transparent conversations like we did with workshops, getting all sorts of people into the room. And, you know, we had workshops with clients, trade unions, suppliers, investors. For anyone else, probably it was a risk, but for us, it was about embracing that risk, you know, and being able to learn on the go. So that's my answer. I hope it helps somebody out there.
Yes, no, thanks. You know that it's very interesting that the questions that we have received, they are all of them related about the future and the sense of urgency also that we have. So I want to ask you very briefly, please, if you can, from the different positions that you are and the different roles that you have, if you can tell us about, okay, what about the future? How we address the issue of climate change, and how we make this battle against climate change a fair battle for everyone, that everyone is on board, but at the same time, we are not only on board on the solution, but we participate, because participation is actually a human right. So how we think about the future and how we do it for the future. And also maybe the two questions, you will have 2 minutes, one for it. And also how we measure and how we start to measure this, because I guess every one of us has to show results, and it's important also to make a point to the different stakeholders how we measure social impact. So maybe we could start with Adam.
I was worried you were going to do that. I think so. Measuring things is tricky, isn't it? Because it can push us down some quite sort of isomorphic tendencies, in a way, where we just fill in the same templates to secure the same funding in the same way that we always did, and that's a real challenge, especially when we're looking over such a long term. And there's a quote I found from I've forgotten his name now, Duncan Green, is it, from Oxfam, who said he likened it to bringing up a child, and that you wouldn't come up with a definitive plan and set of measurements for a new baby to figure out what they were going to be when they were 18. And it's the same for a lot of these projects, that there are some principles and you hope they turn into a sort of nice and productive and committed sort of individual. But would you set out and say a measure of success is they're going to be a civil engineer or a doctor or a vicar or anything? And you wouldn't. And so we have to hold that in mind for our projects. So I'm not sure that's a particularly definitive answer, but it's a reflection anyway.
Yes, that also helps, because it is about, there is no one answer. It will depend about the project that we are working, or will depend the city, actually will depend of the region of the world, will depend of the people that we are working with. So yeah, no, I think it's a very good requirement for this measurement.
And I forgot what the other part of the question was, I'm afraid.
About the future, like what about this sense of urgency? Do we have like any goal, and how do you do it, for instance, in the council? How this sense of urgency about adaptation to climate change is incorporated?
Well, so for us in a UK built environment context, of course, we're led by planning frameworks. So national planning policy as translated down into local planning policy, as translated down into neighbourhood planning, with cycles of planning of generally 10 to 20 years, depending how you do it, and done at a spatial level. However, in Cornwall, as many councils have done in the UK, we've declared a climate change emergency. We are writing a specific, in our language, climate change development plan document, which sets out local standards and interpretations. I suppose my concluding reflection would be, what is interesting is that on a daily basis, we find the tension between what is said in relatively easy discussion forums and political environments versus the decisions that are then made when it actually impacts on, in our context, car use quite often, or behavioural changes that real people are going to have to make in their real lives, and they don't like it. None of us like it because it involves change. And so it is easy to talk about urgency, very hard to do it, and finding a way of holding a mirror up to all of us is probably the hardest task.
Okay, thanks. Maybe Serine, you can tell us something about the UN Habitat, because we know that you have the marker system where you really kind of assess or evaluate not only that a project address risk related with human rights, climate change, gender, youth, and those topics that you have selected as key topics, but you actually measure if they are just sensitive, aware, or they are intentional on this, on creating value and social impact. So if you can briefly explain us about that.
Sure, yes. Yeah, I mean, this has been developed together with the shelter program. So big kudos also to our colleagues from Arcadis, and hopefully some of them are listening in as well. So it's the environmental social safeguard system. And UN Habitat had that already established, but there was an urgency to improve. And that urgency came, or is an internal belief that on the organizational level and in all projects that we do, that we can actually do better. That it's away from do no harm as like also a human rights principle to do better, do good and do even better. And it looks at different principles from gender and so on, as you mentioned, inclusivity, climate change, and so on. But it means that each of our projects that are submitted internally are reviewed first and have to mark, be responsive to each of those principles. So be gender responsive, be inclusive, be and so on. And they're very criticized. So in terms of like, if you have a project that is not very holistic enough, then the review committee will ensure that you will get the productive criticism, and then you review your project again, so that already in the preparational phase, in the design phase, and that screening is done also throughout the project cycle, implementation and closure. In all these phases, you uphold those environmental social safeguard principles. So that is very critical. But in terms of then really, evaluating it, you mentioned future and how do we actually measure our social impact. On one side, I believe the future is now. It's such a cliche. I'm sorry, I know, but I really believe that coming from a law perspective, I've seen in policies how we are kind of postponing the responsibility to act now. We're saying, let's meet net zero by 2050. Let's meet net zero by 2070, which just is a shift of responsibility to future generations. But if we don't act now and we don't steer already the actions and are true to that, then it is going to be even more difficult for future generations to meet that same target. Net zero by 2050, net zero by 2070, and so on. And that's not fair. So that's why we need to say, make it happen today. There's with climate change, the emergency is so prominent. There is no need to convince anybody anymore, apart from former US presidents. But other than that, there's actually no need anymore to convince anybody. And now it's just the time to really act and get together on that. And I remember also this whole setting, sorry to be a bit longer, but the whole setting was also about what can the private sector do. And the private sector is a vast, diverse sector, of course. But as I said at the beginning, everyone has a different role to play. Stakeholders like governments need to see that in their policies, they are reflecting also those human rights. They're reflecting the most urban vulnerable. But then also they need to have measures in place to engage the private sector in a meaningful way, where there is interest that the private sector not only takes the brunt of risk for engaging, for example, in urban basic services, but also has the leverage to bring in new technology and all that without being stuck in administrative burden and procurement processes. And on the other side, the private sector is also there to have those innovative processes, such as like, as when we look at how do we trade carbon emission certificates and all that, and how can the private sector actually come in to accelerate our process and reducing GHG emissions. So that's like becoming their DNA as well, the business DNA to reduce emissions, to be more resilient, to be more adaptive. And the same goes for grassroots, the same goes for NGOs, the same goes for the UN. And that's where the ESSS system, the environmental social safeguard system, is just one tiny piece, and how we can make it better as a project level and as an organization. So I close here. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. And Alison, so how we also work with clients in the project delivery process and adding social value, how we can measure that social value.
Yeah, I'll share some practical things that we've been thinking about. Maybe just first on that future piece and addressing climate change and what are we doing. I like what you said, Serene. What are we doing now? I think there's a huge amount in terms of the industry. We need to look at where skills gaps are and knowledge gaps are. And there's quite a bit of upskilling that we need to be focusing on, and also in the education system, both in terms of the professional kind of your engineering and your design disciplines and all, I should say, all really kind of commercial. Everybody's involved. What are we talking about in the education system, and then also in the construction sector and talking about carbon footprint and how we do, say, waste management and how that works. So I think there's definitely looking at on the ground, do we have the right skills and knowledge? And I think it's really also all about knowledge sharing and dialogue. A lot of the solutions that we're looking at to mitigate climate change and also to address kind of already caused damage, there's not one answer, and there's a lot of people looking at different, do we go electric, do we go hydrogen? We've already had those conversations, and kind of that ongoing dialogue needs to be robust and it needs to be continuous to make sure that we are we're kind of wherever possible taking a joined up approach. And that's not easy across an industry with lots of different players. So I don't say that lightly, but there's lots of groups and organizations making that happen. And I think in terms of measuring, I think the first question we need to ask is, what are we going to use that measurement for? So there's either measuring the impact through the delivery of the project, and that tends to be easier to quantify. So for example, how many apprentices have we employed? How many jobs have we created in the delivery of that project? And when we look at how projects are connected to funding, it's often in the quantifying of that delivery stage social value created. And I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing. I think it can be beneficial for trying to actually understand and quantify impact that's made for the local community through that short-term process. And there are toolkits to do that. Certainly in the UK there are, and being developed globally. I think in a longer term impact, we need to say, well, what are we looking to understand that impact for? And if it's for continuous learning, and if it's really for communities and whether they benefit and whether everybody is included, then that can be more qualitative. And I think if that is about improving the dialogue between asset owners or between developers and communities, that can be a more ongoing thing. And where we think, this is not an Arcadis position, I'm saying from our City Shapers research, certainly, we think that that engaging a social value kind of community group of stakeholders right at the start of the project and allowing them to identify objectives and outcomes that they want to see from the project, and then keeping them involved in safeguarding those throughout the project, and then having a stewardship program where they're involved then after the handover. It gives them a voice to say, yes, this is actually meeting our needs, and whether that needs to be a score of 1 to 10 or whether it needs to be a conversation is about what do you want to do with that knowledge. And I think from our point of view, it's about closing that loop and making sure that they're engaged. I think that being qualitative is where we need to go in a slightly fragile and volatile world.
Yes, thanks, Alison. I'm really sorry, Nana, but we have just a couple of minutes. But okay, we are talking about measuring, and I know that we are in the implementation of the rollout in Arcadis. But what can you tell us about that? What are your thoughts about measuring and about the future, the near future, and in the implementation of our policy?
Look, I actually agree with everything Alison said, so I don't want to take a minute, right? What she said, said it really well. I think that if, first of all, you've got to commit to measure. That's the first thing, because if you don't, you're sort of wading, right? And so that's the first thing. So if you are on this call and you're thinking, where am I and what can I do to help with that future piece you talked about? Ask yourself and maybe talk to your CEO and your leaders, where are you on the commitment around the UN guiding principles? That is the first place. Once you've committed to that, what are you then actually doing around that? And commit to report and measure externally, because you will then be held accountable for it. But the one thing I'd probably end on is that let's always remember that there are two types of entities or groups. You've got an individual. So you as an individual have a part to play in this. The decisions that you make, the choices that you make, the things that you help influence around you. And then, of course, the wider piece, which is your team and therefore your organization. So think about it in two ways and never forget that it's not just about an organization. It starts with the individual. So what's the part that you as an individual are playing in that wider piece?
Great, thanks. I think that this is the best thought that we could finish the webinar today, because actually that is the invitation. It's like, okay, we are part of an organization, we are part of a local government or a multilateral agency or a company, a business. What is our role? Like, how can we contribute not only on addressing risk and violations of human rights, but also how can in our day-to-day life we can promote the human right, the respect of human rights, equality in our day-to-day activities at work, in our organization, but also outside that. I am really happy with the discussion. I think we can be talking because all of us are really passionate about this and really committed, and also sure that this is something that we can work in the organizations that we are in now. I'm really happy for the space that Arcadis has created to discuss this topic. And I think having these differences in the sense that where are we coming from, it's also the great opportunity to plan a future that it includes all. It is the way. Like if companies, local government, multilateral agency, workers, NGOs work in a separate way, it's just impossible. The challenge is too big. And as you also mentioned, it's very urgent as well. So we cannot waste time, we cannot waste energy, we really need to work wherever we are. So thank you very much. I'm really happy, and thank you for everyone that attended today. You can keep in contact with us. There were some questions still that we couldn't answer, so we will come back to you. And thanks to our panelists that prepared this really nice discussion. Thanks, everyone.
And thank you very much for the opportunity. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.